So my name is Mavanwi Warwick and I'm EGM for Regulatory Compliance Global and Executive Sponsor for Rule of Law Initiatives at LexisNexis. Most recently, this involved being part of the Expert Reference Group for the Human Rights and Technology Project led by the Human Rights Commission. The final report was tabled in Parliament this year and contained recommendations on how to protect and promote human rights and how responsible innovation methods could be deployed to achieve positive outcomes. You can view the report at tech.humanrights.gov.au. As a quick summary, it looks at how organisations develop and/or use technologies, including AI, with a particular focus on recommendations for government decision-making and accessibility. I found the project really fascinating and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with people from different organisations across government, private sector, academia and civil society to come up with some practical ways the recommendations can be implemented. I'm also interested in how the recommendations can apply to different role types: board members, human resources and talent acquisition specialists, product managers and procurement, to name a few. I'm going to attempt to tie all of these multifaceted issues back to what it means for a compliance professional, those responsible in the organisation for ensuring that regulatory and legislative frameworks are documented and actioned with the appropriate controls. For this reason, I'm going to ask each of my guests to provide some practical tips on how to make the recommendations a reality. My working theory on this is that organisations that adhere to human rights frameworks will see positive benefits across a wide range of incentives, including employee, customer, shareholder and financial outcomes. So I'm delighted today to be joined by Associate Professor Dr Paul Harpur, who is a leading international and comparative disability rights legal academic, current Australian Research Council Future Fellow, former Fulbright Scholar and TEDx speaker. He is chair of the University of Queensland Disability Inclusion and holds international posts, including as an international distinguished fellow with the Burton Blatt Institute, Syracuse University, and as an academic fellow with the Harvard Law School Project on Disability. Associate Professor Harpur leads a multi-university funded project aiming to combat ableism's influence on human life so that in the future, different ability is not associated with disablement, but instead is accepted as a part of human diversity. So thank you so much, Paul, for talking to me today.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity.
So if we could start off with a few definitions and why terminology is important. As I'm on my journey to understanding these issues better, perhaps we could start off with whether I should refer to people as disabled person, person with disability, person with impairment, or something altogether different.
Well, there's two big schools of thought. The British approach focuses on the individual being disabled. So the idea is that someone in a wheelchair has just a difference. And when society decides to put in steps instead of a ramp, that person becomes disabled. So they like the terminology disabled person. Whereas the United States focuses more on the rights and the individual. So they want to put the person first. So you see the Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Person first. Personally, I prefer the US approach, but I've also used the UK approach where the journal prefers it. So it's basically, they're the main two approaches. So person with a disability or disabled person is probably your safest two bets.
Well, thank you. And I think you mentioned previously that also might be useful to ask people how they like to be referred to and not make assumptions in groups.
Yeah, it's a good way to operate. It's just safer, and particularly if you're giving a speech.
Yes, well, I am hoping that other people like me are interested to learn how to do this and how we can all do better on these sort of issues. So if we go back to the Human Rights and Technology report, there are a lot of challenges mentioned in the report, as well as opportunities as well, where we see technology actually improving individuals' human rights. Do you have any overall thoughts or recommendations on those that have been raised by the project?
Yeah, well, I think, you know the report's, it's big. So we've got like 15 chapters with 3 appendices, and it's just over 300 pages long. So if you wanted to sit down for a couple of nights reading, it's pretty thick. And what it does, it overall provides a human rights approach and presents a national strategy on emerging technologies. The area I found personally the most interesting, the artificial intelligence part and how they can be used to be inclusive was very useful. I mean, I use an iPhone now to get around it when I'm in actually, I'm just moving house, buying the big boy house because I got a promotion. And walking around, I'm actually using artificial intelligence to work out where I am. And I have a mobility instructor, and the AI is telling me what shops are around, what bus stops are there. And I'm walking around going, this is heaps easier. And I only moved in, to the suburb a few years ago into another house, which we're getting rid of. But the point was, when I learned the other place, the technology wasn't as good. And I can tell in that 5-year period, I've noticed a really big improvement in it makes my life practically easier. So we hear a lot of bad stuff about technology, but for me, there's also a lot of benefits.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I was also talking to someone this morning about the world of virtual reality and how it can be used for intellectual and cognitive disability, so that instead of perhaps complex language, symbols can appear as the person attempts to navigate the suburb they live in or the city that they're visiting. So yeah, I agree, there are a lot of opportunities here, and it's just making sure, I suppose, that we put the right guardrails in process as well.
Yeah, which actually leads into a part of the report that on universal design. So
right. And would you for those of us who haven't waded through the 300 pages, although I have myself as a member of the group, how would you describe universal design to someone who's coming new to that?
Well, universal design, it's the concept that, in this case technology, but society, policies, practices, everything should be designed to include as many people as possible without need for adaptation or change. So the idea is not that everyone is included, but you try and include as many people as you can. So if you think about, often we design a product for a certain amount of users. The designer sets the scope. With universal design, the idea is you set that much wider and trying to include more people inside, which means more people can use the technology without having to adopt assistive technology. And I could stick with the iPhone as an example. And back when I used to be at university, I'm still at university, when I was a student at university, I had my mobile or cell phone, I had to get technology put onto it, so specialized software, which meant I had to buy the phone, get the right type of phone, put it in this packaging, send it off. They'd put it on and send it back. And then my phone would talk. Now I pick up my iPhone and I just say, turn voiceover on. And if I didn't have it on silent, it would say voiceover on. But so quick it is. And every single smartphone has that because it's adopted universal design, which means when I was actually a good example of what that meant for me in practical terms was in 2020, I was over at Harvard Law School on a Fulbright and I was teaching. My iPhone did something wacky, no idea what. I couldn't get it to work. But I walked up to the first store and they directed me to the next one who dealt with Apple products. The Apple person played with it, fixed it, and get back to me. That was specialized disability technology. I would have had to probably go across to find someone. There probably was someone actually. There would have been someone in Boston who could have fixed it, but I can tell you it wouldn't have been a stroll from Pound Hall, where my office was, down to Harvard Square via the ice cream shop to get someone to look at it.
I love the visual imagery and your prioritisation in that journey. And I think that's a really good point on the commercial benefits as well, that surely designing a product that's able to be utilised by more of the population makes sense for an organisation, and also in terms of repairing or being able to expand it in the future. Again, universal design just makes commercial sense as well as human rights value.
Well, it does. I think it was increasingly we have people with disabilities are getting more and more into work. If we look at the University of Queensland, when I started chairing the University of Queensland Disability Inclusion Group, we had about 4.4% of our student population had a disability, and that's been steadily increasing. And with COVID, it's skyrocketed, and we're up over about 8.8% of our whole population has a disability. Now, if you think about that, you say around 15 to 20% of the population broadly has a disability. So that's probably about more people with disabilities tend to go to university because it's easier to get jobs with a degree. So but if that continues, you're going to have a huge number of people with disabilities entering the workplace. And that means lawyers with disabilities, it means politicians with disabilities, And there are lawyers. I mean, I'm speaking on Thursday, I think, and at a top tier law firm at a disability in the law function. And there's a room full of lawyers with disabilities. Many of them are from top tier firms.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk to you about that, the talent acquisition and retention process. But I think you're right that it starts off with education and access to education. Just a bit of a left field question, but do you think COVID has assisted in increasing those numbers in that universities have adapted to a more online learning environment?
Yeah, and I also I think everyone in the sector has been surprised just how quickly a sector which probably, I mean, sandstone you don't think sandstone, you don't think you don't think Silicon Valley pivot quickly, but within a week, an approach which has essentially been in place since the 1600s, but with minor changes, pivoted to an online environment entirely. So and most universities did it pretty well. And usually policy on the run is policy underdone. In some cases that was the situation, but a surprising benefit were persons with disabilities. The students found, like a number of our students have trouble getting to campus. So it's actually hard to get to campus all the time. Well, now they're doing it they had to get permission to do it from home, had to struggle to get all these permissions. Now it's standard. And another advantage was transcripts for people who have hearing impairments. You noted just as this has got a transcript and how it's getting better. Well, transcripts are now standard. And where a student in 2019 would have been requesting a transcript, now that doesn't appear. It's a standard. And if there wasn't a transcript, because our international students really call out for it, a huge percentage of our customer base would be upset, and it would be actioned and fixed very, very, very quickly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was trying to, while you were talking, think of the proper scientific relationship between sand and silicon, but I couldn't quite get there. So, but I think that's something worthy of picking up later. So, and I think this is a really great silver lining in all the challenges of COVID, and possibly also for people with disability, that once the majority of the population requires something, there is also some flow-on benefits to people who have needed it as part of their basic rights. But if we could just switch over about where you think actually having people who have disabilities who go on to become lawyers, top of their profession, how do you think that benefits the organisation? We've seen the rise of shareholder activism and people generally understanding there is a benefit there, but what about the benefit for the individual and the individual organisation?
Well, I mean, the individual, they're two different questions. Well, there's three layers of benefits. There's the state, there's the business, and there's the individual. I mean, the state benefits is very blunt and very obvious. If you have 15% of the 20% of the population not working and on welfare, or you have 15 to 20% of that population earning money, paying taxes, the benefit is just, we're talking billions. So there's a huge benefit for the state. We're forgetting, even without rights, without anything else, there's a money benefit, there's a financial benefit. The employer proposition, it's not always as obvious, because businesses often look for money, that's a driver. But one thing I always think about when we talk about, and I don't want to say the question is invalid, because it is, but one of the things people don't say, should we hire women anymore? That thought would be, it wouldn't be, but when I was just doing some reading last night, it was interesting, why should we hire a woman? And it was obviously a 1950s, 1960s, and you're sitting there going, it's just how far that has come, and realistically, my parents' generation. And now I think to myself, how far we've come in the last 25 years with disability. I wonder by the end of my career where we'll be, because the value of people with disabilities is increasing. And it made me reflect on what value as an individual do I bring that's different. I mean, obviously I have different perspectives, but I also think that one thing is I'm a really good problem solver, because when I was growing up, I had to problem solve everything was a challenge, like much more. So for example, books and print material, I had to scan my own materials, and I had to, there was OSLI, and most databases weren't very accessible. you had, and I could probably give the example here of Lexis.com, and if you ever had occasion to pick up my PhD, you'd see there's a lot of American citations, and that was because Lexis was more accessible than the other websites. In fact, one of the reasons I ended up focusing on American law as a comparator was that I could access so many American databases, which of course then led me to a visiting fellowship in 2008 at Harvard Law School, which in turn led me to publish with my friend there, Michael, a number of times over the years, go back again and again until I got offered a Fulbright where I'm back again. And so my entire career.
That's great to hear that we've played a small part.
Quite a big part, because I was able to, because I couldn't access stuff on England.
Yeah.
Now, in law, UK is obviously a big, a lot of areas it's a comparator. Yeah. Because we're English law, but for me it was hard to get access to English journals, so I focused on American because I could get access there, and that guided my career to that focus.
That is an unexpected but very welcome comment. But what do you is this something you've experienced with LexisNexis recently? Have you seen things that we're doing well that we could do better? I mean, we are looking for practical tips, and even though this is supposed to be for a wider audience, I'm sure people in the information profession are just as keen to hear from you.
Well, I'm what you call a dumb user, so I'm probably not the best person. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But I think what's really helpful is to get a group of users together, have a disability, and law students, for example, practitioners, just put the survey out. But in the survey, ask, when you put your customer surveys out, include, do you have a disability? How do you find it? You guys have the RELX group collectively. You've got Elsevier, you've got Lexis, you've got the Reed International, huge amount of users, and then all your the corporate social responsibility ones you're doing with other places. So if you included questions around access to all of those, you get a lot of nuanced responses pretty quickly, and you could bring them into play to develop responses. I mean, you don't even have to ask someone. You could use AI to check. You could see how, when I use a screen, for example, I use a screen reader, and with what do you call it? The computer picks up, the computer knows what I'm using that, so you could identify at what point users leave the site, for example.
Yeah, I've also read there are things we could use, like checking whether someone's using the keyboard shortcuts rather than a mouse, and there are technical ways to get that information. But yes, I think that's right, and a very simple practical tip, which is just to ask what you would do.
And if you can't do it without a mouse, it's probably not doable for me.
Okay. Yes. So that is probably a good way that we could test what's going on. And certainly from a LexisNexis point of view, we are keen to avoid any issues. When you're the publisher of the law and regulations, I think in our minds we'd like to reach a higher standard. I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about the WCAG or protocols that may be suitable now but need enhancement or improvement in the future that organisations that are looking to implement them should use?
Well, I think one of the interesting approaches which is coming out is there's a distinction between compliance and usability. It's phrased variously, but one, people they focus on, is it compliant? Another is it fit for purpose? So can you use it the way that you would need to use it? So So when you think about, is a web accessible, you don't think that's like a basic, but can you use it for what you want? And I think that's the distinction, because if you're thinking about a customer without a disability, if your customer could get access to information even though it was painful, slow, and they'd prefer to be somewhere else, that probably wouldn't be what what you're seeking. You're after the best experience possible. So I think that's something to bear in mind, that you need to have things that are able to be altered. So graphics for people who use contrast, people who use screen readers, they want to have keystrokes. Use preferably the quickest way to navigate through systems without too much information. So all these different approaches within the one platform, because a lot of it's just a front end. Once you've got the front end with a few variations, it's not very hard to all the information comes in the same path. So It's not that difficult to get set up like that.
Well, yeah, and I agree with you. I think compliance should be a baseline, not your North Star, although it is an important part of, especially compliance professionals' life. And certainly we've seen companies benefit when they adhere to the SDGs or report against the SDGs. So they're going to that high standard. Do you have any views on the co-regulation, voluntary codes that you think may help people who are looking for how they can achieve that best practice? Maybe
I think that one of my view used to be that I thought voluntary codes were not very helpful, but what I've found, particularly where I'm at here at the University of Queensland, if it's a legal question, it goes to the lawyers. If it's a voluntary above compliance, it goes to innovators and managers and people that and users, and we try and work something out. So we can be, I think, sometimes leaving some issues to industry enables industry to innovate and come up with answers which can be better than any regulator can come up with. So I think regulations you have to, for the baseline, have to have regulation and has to be enforceable. But I think there's a lot of, if you can get people motivated to be interested in accessibility, then I think there's a lot more scope.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think one of the good things about the way the Human Rights and Technology Project was run is that it did look to the private sector as well as government, as well as civil society, as well as academia as well, because I think there's strengths in those groups working together as well.
And I mean, and with you guys, I mean, Lexis in particular, you sell your products to every single university in Australia, and I know for a fact that every university in Australia, every library, it wants to have it accessible to students with disabilities and to staff. So the more you can actually do to show that you're accessible and that you respond quickly to complaints, the more happy some of your major clients are. And the top tier law firms, if you look at, I'm giving a speech on Thursday to a top tier law firm, and they have an interest in showing that they're being including for people with disabilities. So buying from a supplier who's actively showing that they're inclusive and they're going above and beyond fits into their what the individuals want to do as well as what the corporation wants to do.
Yeah, I could not agree more with that. I'm not sure if you're aware, LexisNexis corporate mission is to advance the rule of law, and that's certainly something that resonates with me and is something that I feel is important in my work, however it manifests. So I think that's a really well made point.
Well, on that, I mean, people with intellectual disability, for example, it's very hard for them to digest legal content. Well, it depends on the level, but so if you think about that, if you can't access any law, you don't understand the system, you don't understand who to talk to, and how your capacity to agitate for your rights is reduced.
Yeah, I think that wasn't an expected part of this conversation, but I think it's a really valuable one. Even in the report, as you referred to, being 300 pages, and there was an overview and a summary, but I think the easy English version was also a really important part of that project, and I think it's one way that organisations can look to making information more accessible. We probably don't have time to go into the entire legal profession and make
just on that, I actually use the easy read of a lot of myself because they're short. Yeah. If I want to read a report, I often grab the easy read just to skim it, have it read. It's easier, it's less dense, and it's 20 pages instead of 300. So if there's 6 reports I'd like to read and I only have time to read one, if I read the easy read versions, I can read all the report, get enough information from all of them to work out which ones I really need to focus on.
Yeah, so it's useful as well as correct, I think, is the way I could put that. So I just want to finish, you've been so helpful with many practical tips, I think, throughout this conversation, but are there particular things you would direct organisations, whether they're government, private sector, academic, or even NGOs? I mean, we can all improve our best practice in terms of implementing the recommendations and achieving the outcomes the report intended.
Well, there's obviously a whole appendix on the recommendations The one I think is really important is around this idea. They talk about functional design, universal design, so trying to make it inclusive for as many people as possible. And I think that's a really easy one, because you just need to think about, when you're designing something, who is your user? So who is your user? And a lot of the times it's the you think it's a lawyer, or you think it's whoever it is. Well, think about what other needs that user might have, and expand your concept of who is your user, and even do your research. Well, there's lawyers in electric wheelchairs who would have trouble turning, how they operate slightly differently with turning pages and with the mouse. You've got blind lawyers, deaf lawyers. So I mean, just simply in our profession, there's a variety.
Yeah, I think we often use personas, which hopefully represent different groups. And again, maybe that's a topic for another time, who those personas should represent and how to group different needs within the legal population as well as the general population. But I think that's a really good point. Who is your user and how are you going to meet their needs? That should be both a commercial and a human rights imperative. So very good. Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of the session today. I really want to thank you for being so generous with your insights and your experience. So thank you very much, Dr. Harpur.
Thank you.